This is a little bit more severe, what I want to share with you today, this evening. And it is under the title Voices from Pavlivka. Pavlivka. It's a psychiatric hospital in Kyiv. And the piece is written by Ellen Barry with some help by other writers and translators. But I want to share this with you because it to me, when I read this, it showed how disgusting and rotten and filthy people like Ron DeSantis really are. So, without further ado, the soldier cannot speak about what happened to him. It's been a month since the tragedy, as he calls it. When the subject arises, he freezes and looks at the floor. He gulps for air. He cannot say it. His doctor, a motherly woman, speaks for him. There were 4 of them. They were stationed near the front line in eastern Ukraine. And on that night, they shot a Russian drone from the sky, a small victory. Then its wreckage hurled down, hunks of ragged metal slicing into the men below. He was the only one left standing. In the numb hours that followed, someone came to collect the others, 1 dead, 2 wounded, and he was left to hold the position alone through that freezing night and into the next day. By the time they came for him, he could not find words. That's it, the psychiatrist said. He withdrew into himself and doesn't want anything. The soldier has been sent for treatment to a Kyiv psychiatric hospital named for Ivan Pavlov, Pavlivka, as it's known. In peacetime, Pavlivka treated people with severe mental illnesses, mostly schizophrenia. But the war has forced a pivot. Hospitals in Ukraine cannot manage the volume of psychiatric casualties coming in, and commanders need their troops back. Last June, Pavlivka opened an overflow unit with 40 beds, but 6 weeks later it grew to 100. The soldiers' ward is a quiet place, high-ceilinged, with chessboards and a ping-pong table. You could mistake it for a rest home, except that the door handles have been removed. Nurses make the rounds to distribute pills or to take the patients for injections. The soldiers wear uniforms, but their packs and boots are lined up on the floor beside their beds. In the ward, they wear slippers. A junior lieutenant named Ruslan has the same dream over and over. He dives for a trench, but it is not a trench. It is a grave. He keeps his visits with his wife and children short. He says, "I would like to lie in a hole somewhere and hide." One soldier says when he returned from the combat zone, he no longer had the ability to sleep. Another says he can no longer tolerate crowds, that his thoughts are, quote, like when you go fishing and you tangle the line, end quote. The ward is full of stories like this. Victor is 53. His occupation before the war was a teacher. He says, "The guys say that I talk in my sleep and I fight in the trenches. My fallen brothers, with whom I sit in the trench, ask, 'Vitya, why don't you shoot? You see them approaching?' But I panic. It takes a while to realize that it was just a dream. It's very, very painful. I want to curl up in a corner under a blanket. Some of my brothers in arms were my students. I worked at a school and they attended my training. We were together from the first day of the war in the same trenches on the same positions, and they died, but I didn't." Alexander is 21. He's a former student. "I finished school and joined the Army in 2021. Then the war started and everything went wrong. I had post-concussion syndrome. I stayed in hospital for 21 days. Then I was sent to the military unit. I stayed there for a month and it got worse. And they sent me here. A year passed and I was discharged. I've been diagnosed with schizotypal disorder. I can hear voices. They say to kill, but I'm trying not to listen. Nadia Medvedska is 69 years old. She's a nurse. These patients, they are from the front lines. You have to be very careful with them. We worry about them. They are like our children. They're all very nervous, tense all the time, but you know, kindness conquers the world, because when you are kind with them, they treat you the same way. Each war teaches us something new about trauma. In World War I, hospitals overflowed with soldiers who screamed or froze or wept, described in medical texts as moral invalids. By the end of World War II, a more sympathetic view had emerged that even the hardiest soldier would suffer a psychological collapse after sufficient time in combat. Somewhere, 2 experts from the Surgeon General's office concluded between 200 and 240 days on average. Russia's war in Ukraine stands out among modern wars for its extreme violence. Its front lines are close together and barraged with heavy artillery, and rotations from the front lines are infrequent. Ukraine's forces are largely made up of men and women who, until a year ago, had no experience in combat. Robert Van Voren, who heads the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry, which provides mental health support in Ukraine, said, "We are looking at a war that is basically a repetition of the First World War. People just cannot fight anymore for psychological reasons. People are at the front lines too long, and at a certain point they crack. That's the reality we have to deal with." Stanislav, he's 29 years old. He's a former cook. "I didn't plan to end up here. About 6 months in the position, I started feeling no passion for life. You're in one place all the time. Every day is the same. It's the monotony. Gray days go by, day after day, and nothing changes. Eventually, I lost my appetite. Sleep is also not very good. My psychological state deteriorated. I became fidgety. I can't concentrate on one thing. I'm grabbing at everything, and there's no order in my head. Best case scenario, I would like to get out of here as soon as possible to be discharged. I have to start living a normal life somehow." Andre is 27. He used to be a logistician for a supermarket company. "There are lots of things in my head, you know? Like when you go fishing and you tangle the line. During the defense at Pavlivka, a mine hit my trench and I was shell-shocked. My eyesight worsened and I'm very nervous about it. When will I get it back to normal? I now overthink a lot. I take all problems to heart. I'm very happy when my family and fiancé come, but it's like I'm not with them. They are here, they ask questions, joking, but I am withdrawn. I used to be such a cheerful guy before all this. Now I'm mostly sad. I'm better off alone." Yulia, who's 47. Before the war, she was an independent forensic expert. Now she's a combat medic and a soldier. "I'm a combat medic. I can't stand the things I've seen. In Irpan, there was a basement where people gathered. They didn't leave the basement for 3 or 4 days, but the children couldn't stand the pressure. I'm a grandmother, so it's very hard for me to see the kids, to see they can't run around, they can't walk or cry or talk. Like everyone else, I ask myself, what are the people guilty of? Why do they have to live like this?" When you don't find many answers, the questions accumulate. When you start seeing answers, and the answers don't correspond to reality, you lose your mind. With each conflict, our view of trauma has become more expansive. In the aftermath of Vietnam, it became clear that wartime experiences could imprint a generation of men, making it difficult for them to work or take part in family life. Now, researchers believe that the effects of trauma may stretch even further, beyond the end of a human life, encoding traits that shape children not yet born. These possibilities haunt Dr. Ola Shaban, a psychiatrist who has advised Ukraine's defense ministry. He has observed Ukraine soldiers since 2014 when Russia seized Crimea. Shaban finds them intensely focused in combat, sharpened by adrenaline. It's when they leave the war zone that symptoms begin to surface, nightmares and flashbacks and insomnia. Shaban, a professor of psychology at the Bogomolets National Medical University in Kyiv, worries about what this will mean in years to come. Epidemiologists studying children born after famine have found decades later traces of what their parents experienced. Higher rates of obesity, schizophrenia, diabetes. Their lives are shorter. He says, "It worries me. I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live in a country called Ukraine." Serhiy, 42 years old, former employee at a shipping company. On April 28, 2022, I joined the Air Assault Forces. The most memorable day was the 26th of May. We were shelled twice, and twice I miraculously remained alive. A lot of the guys died, not least because of the mediocre leadership of our unit. In 8 days, almost the entire battalion was destroyed. In the first months, I even fought without a first aid kit. I was shocked that they sell drugs. Everyone knows who does this, whether it is controlled by the police and the military. I arrived inspired. I came to fight for my country. I'm going to continue to fight. But I was disappointed. Ruslan, 45 years old. Former occupation, he was a construction worker. We are the shock troopers, the diehards. We didn't sleep. We could stay awake for 5 days, not eat for 5 days. We were taking the right bank of Kherson. And there I was, wounded and shell-shocked. A lot of my guys were dead. They were burning in armored personnel carriers. I saw it with my own eyes. I got hit with a grenade, but it didn't explode. I got hit in the vest. Then I flew 20 meters away. I wound up with shell shock. My wife died 4 years ago, and I have no children. I do have an aunt and cousins. They call me. They worry because I'm alone. Mykola Shevchenko is 59 years old. She's a nurse. I just transferred here 2 years ago. This work is very particular in the sense that the guys come mostly from the front lines. They need an individualized approach. Each guy's condition is different. I start in the morning, have a conversation with them, and I assess his condition. I adjust to each person in this way. For the doctors at Pavlivka, it is all they can do to keep up. Dr. Antonia Andrienko, who oversees one of the soldiers' wards, realized early on that her workload would not allow her to go home. On weeknights, she sleeps on a cot in her office. In her ward, the soldiers rest and take smoke breaks. There is no gym, just 2 exercise bikes in a room off her office, and no psychotherapists. Standard treatment at the hospital, says its director, is as it was, mostly just medication. After 3 or 4 weeks, soldiers return to their units to be assigned by a medical commission, to be assessed by a medical commission. The doctor estimates that some 70% of them will return to duty. He says, this is the reality in which we work. Either we return them to the armed forces, or we recommend to declare them unfit for military service due to pronounced changes in personality and psychological trauma. In her office, Dr. Andrienko listens to them, sometimes for hours. She starts by asking about simple things. the pain in a soldier's back or stomach, circling around the subject of the terrible things they've seen. This is what they need, she says, someone to listen to their stories. Their wives and children cannot do it. Once they start talking, it can be hard to get them to stop. There was a soldier whose parents lived in the gray zone, and they were sitting in the kitchen when someone threw a grenade in the window. He went home to collect their remains and took 2 bags, one for his father, one for his mother. The psychiatrist said, "What tablet, what medicine will help?" She groped for something to say to the soldier and finally told him to compensate for this somehow. You have to find a girl and marry and give birth to 5 children and give them all the love which you could not receive from your parents. Her voice wavered. She swallowed. She said, "In the current situation, no pill will help." The soldiers described symptoms coming on mysteriously as a failing of the body. Alexander, a fisherman before the war, began to feel it during a rotation from the combat zone. He stuttered, his hand shook, his blood pressure rose. He was no longer in danger, but his body was permanently on alert. Ruslan, the junior lieutenant, was an art teacher before the Russian invasion. Now he cannot shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. In Bakhmut, he commanded a sapper unit and was assigned to plant mines in front of Ukrainian lines, steering a vehicle loaded with ammunition and men back and forth, under fire. He made it through incredibly. But this is the paradox. Now the experience is with him all the time. He says, "All the horrors in Bakhmut are now starting to haunt me. It was hell. I live in hell." Many describe a feeling of remoteness, even among family. Valerie, who was in construction work before the war, says, "Sometimes my wife talks to me, and then she will notice. She says, 'Did you hear what I said?' It's true. Sometimes he can't hear her. His thoughts rotate on an axis, something that happened at the front, a whole crew, his friends who burned to death inside a tank. He remembers their names, their hometowns, their positions, the names of their wives." Valerie recalls promising one of them in a conversation just before sleep to help fix his roof. He says, "Our beds were next to each other, and then he was dead." The bodies had not been retrieved from the site of the fire, and this fact eats at him. Another thing eats at him, too. One wife asked how her husband died, and he couldn't tell her. He says, "Sometimes I wake up at night and can't breathe. It takes time to calm down. I have a pill ready on my bedside table to take right away." He has been in the ward since the summer, but other men arrive and depart. The soldier, stunned into silence by the drone attack, was off again last week, scheduled to appear before a medical commission that would determine whether he was fit to return to war. Dr. Andrianko says, quote, "He was grasping at straws to avoid going back. This is a familiar refrain. They will say, 'Mama Tania, write something so I can stay another 2 days.'" She tries to approach these questions practically. The country is fighting a full-scale war. Before the soldiers leave, she takes their photographs. She hangs them on the wall so she won't forget them. The living ones in a gallery in her office, the dead ones in the hallway outside. One of the contributors to this article is Ellen Berry. She covers mental health for the New York Times, and she was previously the bureau chief in Moscow. And she was part of the team that won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for a series on impunity in Russia's justice system, so-called. The totality of that interview, while it spares us, you and me, the reader, the listener, with the horror, the absolute horror, the smashed bodies, decapitated people, arms, legs, torsos laying on the highways. It spares us that. This story was conducted inside a psychiatric hospital in Kyiv. And then we have somebody like Ron DeSantis, who sends a message to the butcher of Kyiv, the butcher of Ukraine, the Christian fascist dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Ron DeSantis sends a message to Vladimir Putin, and the message is very simple. You might call it a dog whistle or whatever you want to call it, but the message is essentially, if I get elected president, Comrade Putin, if I, Ron DeSantis, am elected president of this country, I will make sure that assistance to the Ukrainians stops. And you will win your war. So all you have to do, Mr. Putin, is just stretch it out a bit. Stretch it out till November 24. Just stretch it out. A year and a half. You can do it. Cut back on the number of troops that you send into actual combat. Just have them line up along the border of Ukraine and let nobody out. And kill as many as you can, my brother. But when I'm elected president, I will make sure that all of your wishes, Mr. Putin, are granted. You will have Ukraine. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.